Connor Mead, and I'm here today at the 2017 Canadian Science Policy Conference. And joining me right now is Dr. Kathryn, Executive Director of Performance Management and Evaluation at Alberta Innovates. So Kathryn, thank you so much for joining me. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the opportunity for this talk.
Our pleasure.
Yeah.
So in a few minutes, we're going to go and eat lunch and learn about the Naylor report. A key conclusion of which was the weakness of evaluation as an aspect of Canadian science policy. So I wonder if you could speak to what creates this weakness and what can we do to fix it?
Yeah, so I think one of the weaknesses in Canada is we don't have common frameworks which allow us to have a common language. Also in terms of evaluation, or in terms, in my area in particular, in impact assessment. So having common frameworks allows us to interact across different disciplines, to kind of share language, and also as practitioners to share tools in terms of evaluating both the outcomes and the assessment of research and innovation across the continuum of research and innovation, from basic discovery research to applied and translational. So I think that is one of the weaknesses in that area.
So do you think that we face any obstacles regarding the diversity of frameworks that are used across jurisdictions and sectors? And if so, what can we do to better manage the diversity of frameworks?
Yeah, I think there's numerous frameworks across all the provinces and federally. And so I know with the work with the National Alliance of the Provincial Health Research Organizations, NAFRO, for the last 10 years have been really looking at a common framework. The framework is called the Canadian Academy Health Sciences Impact Framework. And so what that has allowed the Alliance is really work together on agreed understanding of what impact is, ways to both measure the impact and also communicate that impact. So that's very powerful for Canada. Also, I would say it really speaks to a community and a grassroots approach in addressing that. So there are many alliances in Canada now really starting to gel and to move forward looking at the impact. Another good example is CSPC, the Canadian Health Services Policy Research Alliance, and we're also using CAS as a common frame, but what we're looking at is really doing a deep dive in terms of informing decision-making impact, and of relevance here today is policy impact. And so again, in that area, we're looking at how do we demonstrate impact, how do we measure impact, and how do we communicate impact. And that is a powerful strategy and tool for research and innovation. It's very important that we understand what works, what doesn't work under certain conditions, so we can improve and learn. And having these Canadian frameworks, other countries across the world are now looking to Canada in this area on the work we're doing. So,
great. So it seems like there's a more widespread recognition of the value of impact measurement and the value of collecting and using evidence in health research and research and innovation in general. But what might be some of the costs associated with, or I guess another way to phrase it would be, how do we find the optimal level of investment in evaluation and performance measurement that sort of navigates the dangers of not measuring impact or the dangers of over-investing?
Yeah.
And as kind of a follow-on to that, how do we manage expectations for policymakers and the public in terms of what sort of impact measurement is feasible and what we can legitimately expect from valid impact measurement?
Yeah, so I think to the first question in terms of investments, in terms of costs for evaluation, the general rule of thumb is 1 to 5% of the total funding in terms of research and innovation. In England, with the Research Excellence Framework, which brought in impact as part of their assessment for allocating dollars to the higher education institutes, I think their transaction costs were about 3.5% of that investment. So that tends to be the general rule of thumb that for looking at the investment costs. And so, what was the other question?
Well, so how do we manage the expectations of policymakers and the public in terms of what's possible to measure?
Yeah, so I think that is quite a challenge. The expectations are very high particularly in terms of science, research and innovation. It's the long game, so it can take up to 20 years for an impact to be realized. So one way to kind of mitigate that and kind of meet expectations is what we do at Alberta Innovates is what we set up our monitoring systems to monitor the progress and the achievement towards the impact. And then when time has passed or sufficient time has passed, we'll do an impact assessment to see if that impact occurred. So it helps meet the different needs in terms of urgency as well as the long term. So for example, we did an impact assessment in terms of mental health case studies. It was an international study with NIH out of the US, NIHR out of the UK, and it was 20 years ago when we actually had funded that research. So we looked at the impact. So having those expectations won't go away, but I think as a community, if we work through different tools and practices to kind of meet them, and as well as part of the education in saying that the long term is also very important, keeping an eye on the long term.
Fantastic. Well, so my last question before we wrap up and head into lunch is for those of us who are watching at home, where can we go to learn more about this work?
Yeah, so at NAFRO has a website, so that's one area to go and look at information. At our organization, Alberta Innovates, we also have a site there. And also Alberta Innovates co-founded an international school and research impact assessment, which is also on the website. And what it really does is take a very practical approach to how to assess impact, how to measure it, and how to monitor it. And there's a lot of tools in that regard. I would say particularly of note with the ISRIA, takes a very common sense approach and uses a 6-block approach when it comes to assessing impact, a bit like the scientific method. It's agnostic, and it really takes the person to looking at, what is the purpose of the assessment, who are the stakeholders, what are their questions, and we always start with those basic fundamentals before we go into measurement or communication or framework. So I would recommend going to that in terms of resources.
Excellent. Well, Dr. Graham, thank you so much for joining me today. It's been a pleasure to have this conversation, and hope you enjoy the final day of the conference.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks.